17.3 takes us a little bit farther into how two different species can come from a common ancestor. Speciation, first of all, is the formation of a new species. A species, make sure you understand this, is a population whose members can interbreed and produce fertile offspring. So, as you're looking at this, think about what we talked about, a donkey plus a horse. Talked about this with artificial selection, interbreeding. A donkey and a horse can interbreed and produce a mule. A mule is bigger than a donkey and stronger than a horse, so it's the best of both worlds. But a mule cannot produce fertile offspring. So that means that the donkey and the horse are two separate species. What has to happen in order for two species to form from a common ancestor? Reproductive isolation has to occur. So there are different ways that reproductive isolation can happen, but if they are separated so that they can't produce fertile offspring, then that's where you see that two different species have come along. What we see happening here is time is going from the bottom to the top. The members of a species have a common gene pool down here. There's interbreeding, and for some reason right here, this threshold right here, we see reproductive isolation occurring, and then we see isolated gene pools, and because of that, we get separate species. So let's examine how reproductive isolation can occur. The first way is behavioral isolation. So when two populations, they can interbreed, but they start not interbreeding because they have differences in courtship rituals or other behaviors. Geographic isolation, just like it sounds, where there's a barrier that separates two different parts of a population, rivers, mountains, bodies of water. There are two different squirrels on two different ends of the Grand Canyon. Can't get across the Grand Canyon if you're a squirrel, and so there are separate gene pools that are formed, and the genetic changes in one group were not passed on to the other. So we see this divergence. Temporal isolation. If you look at the beginning of this word, temporal, you might think temperature, but think about if you take French or if you take Spanish, any kind of a Latin-based language. In French, time is T-E-M-P-S. In Spanish, I believe it's tiempo, and that is also time. So this is reference to time. Two or more species reproduce at different times. So each species has flowers in this orchid, 3 species of orchid. The flowers only last one day, and that they have to be pollinated on that particular day. So because the species bloom on different days, they can't pollinate one another, and we see this divergence. Darwin's hypothesis was that the Galapagos finches had descended from a common ancestor. He said that natural selection shaped the beaks of the different bird populations as they became adapted to eat different foods. So you saw this in chapter 16, the different shapes of the beaks based on the different ways that they eat and what they have to eat. Remember the Grants from Princeton University? They have worked with the finches for years. So Darwin's hypothesis, again, 2 testable assumptions. Beak size and shape to evolve, there must be variation to provide raw material for natural selection, and differences in beak size and shape must produce differences in fitness. So first of all, variation, we have a bell-shaped distribution of polygenic traits. So what that indicates is there's great variation among the Galapagos finches of those inherited traits, of those heritable traits. Here's the data that the Grants have collected. They measured all different kinds of aspects of the finches. The individual finches with different sized beaks had different chances of surviving drought. And this is the kicker here. When food was scarce, individuals with the largest beaks were most likely to survive. So what we see down here on the y-axis, percentage surviving, and then beak size is down here on the x-axis. So as you see an increase in beak size, so you also see an increase in survivability of those finches. So what the grant saw is that average beak size in that particular population increased dramatically over time. Remember, this is called directional selection. So there's one direction that you see that shift, and that's to larger beaks. Competition and climate change in terms of drought. There's less food. Competition between those finches with different beak shapes would drive natural selection as well. The other important thing they have demonstrated is that variation within a species increases the likelihood that the species can adapt and survive environmental change. It doesn't guarantee the survival of every individual, but it guarantees the survival or increases the chances of survival of the species as a whole. What they think happened many years ago, a few finches from South America, species M, so the original species, arrived on one of the Galapagos Islands. Because of the founder effect, it was a small population, the allele frequencies of this founding finch population could have differed from those in the South American population because there were just a few of that South American species that migrated over. Many years ago, a few finches from South America, again species M, arrived on one of the Galapagos Islands. Because of the founder effect, again, the allele frequencies could have differed from those in the South American population. Now what we see here is geographic isolation. So here we have species A on one island migrating to another island, and that same thing happens again. So we have this separation between islands and then separation from the original species in South America. Sorry about that. Something popped up on my computer and I couldn't advance the slide. So over time what we see happening is populations on each island adapted to the local environments. Now we see a divergence, and if you take a look at the beak shapes and the beak sizes, beak B is a little bit bigger than beak A. Now it could be because of the food that's available on those islands. Natural selection could have caused two distinct populations to evolve, each characterized by a new phenotype. So remember that new phenotype, in this case we're calling upon, is beak shape. Behavioral isolation could have also separated these guys. Behavioral isolation, even if there's some sort of intermixing or intermingling, if species B migrated back, maybe there are courtship rituals that are different now. Something with the beak shape or beak size that's different now. There still might be isolation, even if there's not geographical isolation. And then we have competition and continued evolution. Birds that are most different from each other have the highest fitness because they occupy what we're going to talk about later. They occupy different niches, very specific aspects of their lives. More specialized birds have less competition for food. Over time, species evolve in a way that increases the differences between them, and new species may evolve. And that's what you see in this drawing here.